Bill Youngs is a professor of history at Eastern. It's another one of these treasures in our backyard that sometimes we lose sight of when we think about Spokane universities, but I think you're honorary Spokane. And as I learned in the book, Cheney was going to be the government center and vied with Spokane and lost. But you want to read about political shenanigans, read about the dispute and the theft of documents between those two cities. And I won't spoil the show. Bill Youngs, professor of history, author of The Fair and the Falls, to speak about Expo 74, then and now. Bill?
Actually, Cheney won that election for county seat, and Spokane in sour grapes refused to give up the county records. And one dark night, folks from Cheney came over and stole through the night and put all the records into a wagon and took them back to Cheney. I'm not quite sure exactly what happened next, but clearly, in the long run, we did lose. So you're right, John. And thank you so much for I think all of us have to recognize just what an extraordinary job he and others have done here to bring together such a diverse group of speakers. In a sense, I guess I was fairly easy to find, but the various people through other parts of the county in eastern Washington who each had such wonderful insights, it's quite extraordinary. Now, they were all talking mainly about current events, and here I am, a historian. And as I've listened to these talks, I've grown increasingly nervous, and I've been thinking of a cartoon drawn a while back by Gary Larson of WSU. In it, a large elephant is sitting alone on a stage in front of a large audience. He's leaning over a piano, looking nervous and sweating profusely. The caption reads, "What am I doing here? I'm a flautist, not a pianist." So in a sense, I am a flautist, not a pianist, but hopefully that will be interesting. I'm, after all, the only person here tasked to take us into the past. In contrast, Jonathan, Gloria, Aaron, Curtis, Eric, Ty, Twa-Lee, Kelsey, Al, Nate, and Kara, and what a list, eh? As well as our many discussion group leaders, have all dwelt in the main on the present and the future. Fortunately, I have digested all of these wonderful talks, and I've discovered in them a commonality in their contemporary subjects with my historical one. In a sense, I hope to demonstrate that I too can play a piano. To illustrate further the theme of kinship, which I will weave through my talk, I want to invite you first to hear a story dear to my family's memory of an encounter that happened to my father in about 1950 near Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Dad had about 4 hours to spend between flights, and to kill time, he decided to take a walk through a local working-class neighborhood. The day was hot, and when he saw a sign advertising a basement bar, he ducked in for a drink. The room was empty except for a bartender, a gruff giant of a man. "What do you want?" he asked Dad, then a math professor at Indiana University. As I heard the story while growing up, my father first asked for a martini, then decided on the cousin of the martini, a Gibson. While the bartender waited impatiently, Dad thought of Ernest Hemingway's novel, Across the River and Into the Trees. In that book, set in Venice shortly after World War II, an American colonel, Richard Cantwell, favors a martini variation called a Montgomery. The name reflected the colonel's contempt for the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who, it was said, would only fight if he had a troop advantage of 15-1. The drink bearing his name featured a ratio of gin to vermouth of 15-1, much higher than the humble martini. Anyway, after hesitating on his drink order, Dad finally said to this bartender, "Oh, hell, make it a Montgomery." The bartender glared at my father, raised his fist, which I imagined to have been the size of a volleyball, smashed it down on the bar, and declared, "By God, a man who reads." During this conference, John Wallingford has been urging us to see common interests and values where we might not expect to find them. That engagement of the mathematician and the bartender provides one such example. I would argue that the story of Expo 74 provided many examples of wonderful and unexpected commonality. And ultimately, it provides many examples of commonality between them and us almost a half century later. Many of you have spoken at Hope for Creation, have described for us huge challenges you have undertaken and are engaging in today. So one lesson we can take from Expo is the example of not merely taking on big challenges, but arguably undertaking one or several impossible challenges. To fully appreciate the miracle of Expo, we should begin by looking at our wonderful river and falls, and then explore how we nearly lost them, then finally began to recover their natural beauty. The experience of a Ford Pavilion staffer reminds me of the bartender story and provides another example of what we can call unanticipated kinship. Western historian and former Gonzaga professor Bob Carricker directed the construction of the Ford Pavilion at Expo. The exhibit featured several travel-related artifacts, including an early version of a recreational vehicle, Henry Ford's automobile constructed to carry and sleep passengers. Carricker also had the skin for an Indian teepee to be part of the exhibit, but no poles to support it. I learned from Bob that lodgepole pines get their name from their usefulness as, you might guess it, lodgepoles. The Ford Corporation budget for the pavilion included funds to purchase some lodge poles. One day, Carricker took a big station wagon with a big roof rack out into the country east of Spokane. Spotting a promising-looking grove of pines by a ranch house, he drove up to the house, knocked on the door. A big, not-too-friendly-looking man came to the door and asked him what he wanted. Bob explained that he needed to buy lodgepoles for Expo 74. And here the rancher reminds me of that Chicago bartender. He looked sternly at Bob Carricker and said, "I won't sell you those trees. If they're for that expo, I'm going to give them to you." That sort of communality, buy-in to the fair, was one of the forces that allowed Spokane to become the smallest city in the world to that time ever to host a World's Fair. And that sort of communal engagement may serve us as a model as Spokane citizens today, including those of us at Hope for Creation, as we consider environmental challenges of the future. To underscore the importance of our own World Fair, I'm going to take us first to China. The Shanghai Expo of 2010 was the biggest World Fair in history, with 73 million visitors. Almost 200 nations took part, dwarfing the 9 countries who finally exhibited at Spokane. The disparity in size, however, does not diminish the importance of Expo 74. Before the opening of Expo 2010 in Shanghai, the radio and television station there sent film crews around the world to compile an exhaustive documentary on the history of expos. Paris, Osaka, London, New York, and many other great cities were featured. Additionally, a director and film crew came from China to Spokane. I got to know them while they were here and met the director again when I visited Shanghai in 2010. He told me that our fair site was his favorite among all the cities he had visited in making the film. And I still recall how excited his film crew had been one day after viewing and filming Spokane Falls while they were here. To see the Spokane portion of the film, by the way, you can go to YouTube and search these words, Spokane Shanghai Expo. And that film, it's about a 5-minute film looking at the two fairs, will probably show up. And it gives us something to be truly proud of, I would say. My friends in Shanghai gave me a copy of that film, and in it you'll see an interview they conducted with the all-important chair of the Bureau of International Expositions. In it, he says, each World Fair after Expo 74 in Spokane continued the theme of sustainable development. How about that? A city of 30 million, I believe it is now, felt in a certain sense it was following Spokane. In other words, we here set an environmental precedent that has influenced many exhibits since that time. If that film crew from Shanghai TV had come to Spokane 140 years earlier, they would have enjoyed an even more pristine view of the Spokane River than they saw about a dozen years ago. Let's take a moment and try to imagine that long ago landscape. One must walk in the forested countryside outside of Spokane to encounter the essential ingredient of that earlier scene, silence. Try to imagine the impression the falls must have made on Indians traveling through the wilderness long ago by horseback or on foot. Mile after mile, the only sound was the song of birds and the wind in the trees. Then far in the distance came a new sound, first no more discernible than a gentle breeze, but growing louder and more insistent, until at last the falls appeared. Now eyes and ears witnessed the most impressive sight in all that vast region, a tumult of water dropping down, smashing past rocks and islands, sending spray high into the air. In 1873, town builder James Glover first saw those falls. On the morning of May 12, he awoke on the dirt floor of a roofless log cabin, try saying that 6 times fast, where he had just spent his first night by the river. As he rolled out of his blankets, he told himself, "I'm going to see the falls." Remembering that moment later, Glover wrote, "I gave myself completely over to admiration and wonder at the beautiful clear stream that was pouring into the kettle over the falls. I sat there unconscious of anything but the river, gazing and wondering and admiring." The Spokane River must have been magnificent that day. The spring runoff would have sent water surging past the rocks and islands. "I was enchanted and overwhelmed with the beauty and grandeur of everything I saw," wrote Glover. It lay just as nature had made it, with nothing to mar its virgin glory. Well awestruck by the falls, Glover also experienced a different, but equally powerful, sensation: acquisitiveness. Having seen the river's beauty, he made a fateful choice. "I determined that I would possess it." The falls meant beauty, but they also meant water power, and water power meant profits. Soon sawmills and grist mills would obscure the virgin glory of the falls. But Spokane Falls retained its frontier atmosphere for a few years after James Glover arrived. For a short time, Spokane was a destination resort for sports fishermen who came and lodged in small hotels perched on the bank of the river. The first environmental debate in Spokane occurred during what came to be known as the Trout versus lumber controversy of the 1880s. Fishing enthusiasts complained that sawdust from the mills then growing up along the river, the mills that is, growing up along the river, was catching in trout gills, poisoning the fish. For a brief time, the city actually shut down the mills, but soon the lure of industrial profits overwhelmed the fishing lures, and Spokane Falls removed the restrictions on the sawmills. In 1880, at the Spokane River, you could still see sites the Indians had known for centuries. But return to the same place just 10 years later, and you would see a new world. Bridges crossed the river and connected islets to the shore. Railroad tracks ran right beside the falls. Flumes pushed into the current, diverting the water into flour mills and sawmills. Trees were cut back to make way for buildings. Fill dirt had eliminated at least one of the river channels. Piles of lumber lay along the shore, and the floor of one sawmill extended from the south bank of the river to Havermill Island, hiding the southernmost channel. In 1890, Spokane celebrated this victory over nature by hosting something called the Northwest Industrial Fair, arguably the first world fair held in the Northwest because Canada sent exhibits. Scores of businesses provided the industrial base for the fair. The exhibits were designed to entice visitors to make business investments. Their clientele ranged from businessmen interested in mines and manufacture to common citizens eager for the chance to see a wide variety of products and mineral extracts. Ellensburg mounted an exhibit that included a single huge lump of coal weighing 9,500 pounds. And if any of you ever see an article about that and know how they moved that 9,500 pounds from Ellensburg to Spokane, let me know. I want to add it to the new version of my book. Anyway, they were advertising their mineral resources. Another exhibit was a mine in full operation where workers actually drilled a shaft through the rock in the very basement of the exposition. 3 mineralogists were on hand to explain the display. A message to the people of the fair, of the 1890 exposition, by the governor of Idaho, described Spokanites as robust pioneers. He wrote, "It is fitting that the city of Spokane Falls should take the lead in an exposition. It is the gem city, located upon a romantic spot, where the roaming cataract has for ages made music, until within late years, upon the ears of only the nomad, which to them meant nothing, except the crude legends which their uneducated fancy wove into tales of fiction. But to the hardy pioneers," and this is still the governor speaking, not me, "who first discovered the tremendous power which nature had offered for service through the instrumentalities and devices of civilized man, it was not long before the utilization of the wasted power, which for centuries had been offered in vain, was seized upon, and the swift rolling water promptly harnessed to the machinery which the genius of our age has invented. And now, although but a dozen years have passed since the work began, your electric plants, mill races, and hydraulic machinery attest the energy and aggressiveness of the people who comprise your municipality." The most suggestive phrase in this revealing passage was the claim that for centuries the treasures of Spokane Falls had been offered in vain. No matter that the unassisted river had provided fish and provided beauty through all these wasted centuries, the essence of the falls was neither fish nor grandeur, but power to drive mills and illuminate lamps. Reflecting this pride of conquest, one of the fair's most popular exhibits was a model of the Spokane River. J.W. Wentworth, a clothing manufacturer, advised his wares by constructing an enormous pool of water representing the river. Spanning this artificial river was a model bridge built out of shirts, collars, and cuffs. This artifact represented the new steel bridge then under construction at Monroe Street. Even though the scenery depicted by the model was only a mile away, the Wentworth reconstruction was more fanciful than real. In reality, Monroe Street is, of course, at the base runs across the base of the tumult of the lower falls. But the shirt model showed a placid waterway upon which floated a ship and a steamer described as towing 2 large barges loaded with merchandise. Try to imagine that on the lower falls. The image grew from the commercialization of the age, not from any realistic appreciation or even awareness of the actual Spokane River. In such ways, the harnessing of the falls led to a kind of geographical amnesia, the loss of a compelling vision or even awareness of the river. In a sense, the falls were conquered, then forgotten. This amnesia showed itself in other ways as well. By this time, Spokane had built Riverside Avenue several blocks from an actual riverside. Think about that the next time you're walking down Riverside Avenue. Moreover, the town, which had been known in its early years as Spokane Falls, that was its official name initially, became by then and is still known today simply as Spokane. While trains and mills and power lines were destroying the viewscape of the river, industrial and domestic pollution were ruining the river itself. In the 1880s, a ramp for garbage disposal was built out over the river. Just back your wagon up and dump your trash into the waters. The ramp advocates claimed the river was so swift that all garbage dumped there will be at once carried away. Apparently no one asked where it would go once it was carried away. A former colleague of mine at Eastern, Mike Green, was a Spokaneite who remembered fishing in the river during the 1950s, and he described what it looked like beyond the falls. I've clambered down every foot of the bank on the Spokane River, he recalled, the whole length of the city. It's hard to believe that a city could have treated a river as badly as Spokane did that stream. I mean, it was an open sewer. There's no other way to describe it. We flushed our toilets and we dumped our sewage right into the river. The outfalls of the slaughtering plants, all the commercial establishments, diesel fuel, the machine shops, all that stuff went into the open sewers and right into the river. It was an outrage. The willows along the banks would be festooned with all sorts of unmentionables. On Crystal Island, now called Canada Island, an industrial laundry regularly vomited soap straight into the river. Spokaneites cared so little about the river that some even considered, in the 1950s, even proposed paving over the south bank of the river in order to have more space for parking. The river was Spokane's finest natural feature, and during the 1960s it was recognized increasingly as Spokane's most blighted landscape. Slowly, two groups came together to do something about the river. Citizens sought urban renewal simply for aesthetic concerns. Could something be done to beautify the blighted landscape? And the other group was downtown business leaders who'd been losing customers to suburban malls since the 1940s. In many cases, the personnel in both constituencies overlapped. During the 1960s, organizations were formed, plans were discussed, and renewal reports were commissioned. Everyone seemed to agree that some sort of scheme was needed to get urban redevelopment moving. One idea was to create a National Parks Information Center in downtown Spokane. After all, the city is located within a day's drive of many national parks. Another idea was to hold a big party for Spokane on the 100th anniversary of James Glover's founding the town. The movement for urban renewal eventually came into focus when a private corporation, Spokane Unlimited, hired a California development consultant named King Cole. It turned out to be one of the best hires in the history of Spokane. While writing The Fair in the Falls, my book on Expo 74, I interviewed many Spokaneites and heard many compliments directed at King Cole. The following one was by one of our former mayors, Jack Garrity, who said, "King Cole is the greatest visionary and salesman the community has ever known. There are few charmed moments in the life of a city when the people share a common vision. The era of the World's Fair was one such time. King Cole provided that vision." King Cole was not, of course, the only leader or even the only visionary who made possible the World's Fair, but part of his strength was in his ability to engage hundreds and thousands of others in a common cause. Under Cole's guidance, Spokane undertook an arguably impossible challenge, removing railroad tracks and trestles from the riverfront, arranging for the trains to find another way through the city, moving parking lots, a motel, an industrial laundry off the islands, and then replacing them all with lawns and newly built hillsides. Impossible. To make the challenge even greater, the park builders chose an impossible device to accomplish this impossible goal, a World's Fair. We know it happened, but now we all know the impossible did occur. We had the fair, we have the park. But in order to appreciate fully the lessons of Expo 74, we need to look more closely at several of these obstacles and the way that Spokane confronted them. And I think very much of a parallel to challenges facing us today. And what was actually accomplished. To have a World Fair, you need support at many levels, internationally, nationally, as well as from your state and your city. Then you need corporations and entertainers to sign on. King Cole spent so much time for a while traveling around the country and around the world trying to roust up exhibitors that the story is that he, after returning from one trip, he was sitting in a barber chair in downtown Spokane, and he was sort of fidgeting, and the barber asked what was wrong. And he said, "I was looking for my seatbelt." He thought he was in an airplane. So you need to have a World Fair, you need support at many levels. Then you need corporations and entertainers to sign on. Ironically, one of the biggest challenges was to win support in Spokane. We got it in Paris, we got it in Washington, D.C., we got it in Olympia, but one of our biggest obstacles was right here in Spokane. Money came there from around the world, and all that Spokane needed to provide was about $1 million through a bond. The voters voted, as was required, for the bond, and voted for it by a landslide, but not by enough. Approval required 60%. The bond got only 57%. Here I think of something I heard once, more than once in my Expo interviews. King Cole would not let it die. He just would not let it die. Within a few weeks of the Expo defeat, civic leaders proposed a B&O tax. One banker told me that bankers, a B&O tax is as popular as a skunk at a garden party. But it was the fair's only hope, and the city council eventually voted unanimously for the tax, keeping the fair alive. But for a while, backers felt they'd really lost it. Another problem was how to raise funds to provide for other smaller things, relatively, like a building for the housing for the carousel in the park. The foreign exhibitors paid their own costs. The corporations paid for their own pavilions, but certain things like the German beer garden had to come from Spokane. Well, the problem was they wanted it to be very substantial because ultimately it was going to house the famous carousel, which is there in a renewed building now. But how are you going to get the money for it? And one thing I want you to notice is just that the continual imagination of these folks. They're blocked here, they move there. They're like a really good football running back. And what they came up was this idea. They built a German beer garden. And the structure of the beer garden was the base for the carousel. And so during the fair, they made a lot of money off the beer garden. And the carousel, the structure for the carousel paid for itself. Then there was a matter of persuading large corporations. And again, I want to talk about the imagination of the Expo backers. There was the matter of persuading large corporations to mount exhibits at Spokane. Expo promoters found often encountered opposition to spending money, this is by corporations, in a hick town whose name no one could pronounce. And some of us may likely remember the time when you could get on a plane in San Francisco and learn to your surprise that you were on your way to a place called Spokane. And that was pretty much how folks in the national news and elsewhere pronounced Spokane in those days. So anyway, in terms of wooing the foreign exhibitors, one summer day, executives from Ford and GM were in town being entertained and wooed at lunch at a restaurant overlooking the falls. Good idea, right? But it was summer, and the river was dry. That was not the impression the local hosts wanted to give. But then, by prearrangement, as they were leaving the table, one of the hosts said, innocently enough, "Oh, have you seen our falls?" They walked to the windows, and lo and behold, the river was thundering by. The power company, which could afford to lose a bit of money, had released hundreds of thousands of gallons of water just in time. Sorry, I always have trouble not laughing when I remember this. Just in time to cascade through the falls at a prearranged time. The visitors were impressed, and soon afterwards, long after the falls were dry again, Ford announced that it would mount a major exhibit at the fair. These are just a few of the tales of many that make up the big story of Expo 74. It would in fact take an entire book to tell the entire story. Given our focus here today on local environmentalism then and now, let's look at the environmental content of the fair. Some critics argued that because downtown businesses profited, and listen to this, critics argued that because downtown businesses profited from the downtown renewal, this was a business enterprise rather than a genuine environmental fair. So I want to put my professor's cap and robe on to give you a proper response to that. Having studied every aspect of the fair, my response to the critique that business made money is, and here's the professor talking, well, la-ti-da. Arguably, we all profit from a vibrant downtown. As to environmental content at the fair, let me count the ways. The pavilions, foreign and domestic, feature dozens of environmental presentation, but that's another story. Spokanites took part in a variety of consciousness-raising projects for the city itself. Recycling took on a pop culture dimension in pre-Expo Spokane. In 1973, plans were announced for a 2-week drive for cans and bottles that would be crushed and shredded into ingredients for glassfault to be used in the environmental plaza at Expo. Later that year, Expo announced plans for an environmental Christmas tree to be erected at the World's Fair site. Well, what does an environmental Christmas tree look like? The Washington State Department of Ecology provided litter bags for aluminum can collection. Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and 7-Up sent trucks to help pick up the cans, and Reynolds Aluminum provided a mobile recycling machine to crush the cans after their use for the tree. With the holidays approaching, students in Spokane collected a total of 40,000 cans, which were strung on wires from a pole, giving it the shape of an actual tree. It was dedicated in time for Christmas of 1973, just before the fair. Sometimes environmentalism proved to be controversial in unexpected ways. In the highly charged atmosphere of the environmental practices, disputes could erupt over seemingly innocuous subjects. Expo planned to display a metal goat on the fairgrounds with a vacuum table running from its mouth to a trash container. Children would be encouraged to hold paper cups and other garbage to the goat's metal mouth and watch the trash disappear. Now, I would not be fitting in here as a piano player with the rest of you if I didn't ask the audience at least one question. How many of you have seen the metal goat in the last 5 years? Almost all of you. Okay, that's good. I don't know if you noticed, but on April 1, there was an article in the newspapers that it was being removed and put in a museum or some other structure. And I was about to charge City Hall, and a lot of other people were. It turned out, we looked at the calendar, April Fool's, so it's still there. That's good. I got to laugh without even saying anything. At any rate, so they were building the goat. It came to be known as the garbage goat or suction goat. This lesson in cleanliness seemed harmless to the promoters, but it aroused protests from goat lovers throughout the nation. The editor of the Dairy Goat Journal in Scottsdale, Arizona, wrote Expo complaining that the suction goat would be a degrading, debasing, and grossly misleading feature of the fair. Dairy goats, he argued, are most fastidious in their eating habits. A Connecticut goat owner criticized Expo for accepting an old wives' tale about goats and garbage. Such abysmal ignorance can only reflect on your state and your Expo. I've been raising dairy goats for 40 years and have never seen one eat garbage. Arguably the most trenchant criticism of all came from a Spokane youngster who wrote a letter with a drawing of a goat named Jenny. I think the goat at Expo is dumb, she said, because people with goats don't eat garbage. Sometimes they nibble and spit it out. I am 7 years old, and even I know that. Well, fortunately, John Musgrave, who handled publicity relations for Expo, was able to answer such protests with the claim that he too was a goat lover. Amongst my fondest childhood memories, he wrote to one protester, are the companionship I enjoyed with our family dairy goat named Nanny and her kids. Musgrave said that he appreciated the protesters' concerns. Accordingly, a sign would be erected in the goat grotto indicating that goats did not really eat garbage and that the display should not be taken as a derogatory symbol. Being very careful. And I've never seen that. And I think one of our objects in the 50th anniversary should be to put that darn sign up there, fulfill one of the promises of Expo. A single flap a similar flap followed Expo's acceptance of beaver pelts as a down payment for the British Columbia Pavilion. You can imagine the details yourself. During the fair, Expo hosted a series of international conferences and symposia, and here's where the environmentalism gets a lot more serious. One featured a spirited debate between industrialists and environmentalists. At one point, Anthony J. Weiner of the Hudson Institute delivered a plea for economic development. We're like mountain climbers, he said. We don't know whether we can make it, but we know that we can't go back. Now, he said that in front of the wrong person. David Brower was there, and he's often referred to as the arch-druid. He was too radical and too much of an environmentalist, even for the Sierra Club, got kicked out, created a new society. And he was one of America's great mountaineers of the time. So when this fellow said, sometimes you just have to keep going up the mountain, Brower was loaded for bear, ready for him. This is one mountaineer, he said of himself, who's here today because I had enough sense more than once to turn around. He added, I'm a doomsayer because there are so many doom makers around. Doom makers around. In his speech, Brower told this story. An audience was about ready to watch a concert in a large auditorium when someone noticed flames around the bottom of the curtain. The audience startled, and with some anxiety ran for the door. Sensing the emergency was imminent, a musician strolled very nonchalantly over to the piano and very deliberately sat down and began to play. Now, when I first read this story, I expected Brower to say something uplifting with a happy ending. But to the contrary, here's how he ended that story. The pianist played so beautifully that the audience came back to their seats and burned to death. Now, what's that moral of the story? Here's what Brower said. The moral, of course, is beware of a calm piano player. I will not be that calm for you. And so many of us who've spoken have, not been calm piano players entirely. Brower continued with this statement about humanity. It has but a single choice, to learn to live on a small planet. To choose otherwise is to eliminate humanity. Second, he said, I think that a preservation is not a man apart. Everyone is a preservationist, though few admit it openly. We either preserve what makes life possible, or out we go. I like the planet so much that I'd like to preserve Earth as a conservation district within the universe, a sort of Earth National Park. David Brower was one of the most famous environmentalists of his day. He liked Expo, and he said that not only was this a good thing, but it was an actual classic textbook case of a community trying to change the environment. King Cole told me that was a good housekeeping seal of approval as far as we were concerned, coming from Brower. While writing this talk, I've often been frustrated by the challenge of distilling a 600-page book into a 40-minute talk. There's so much more to say about the men and women who built the great urban parks anywhere on Earth and tackled many ongoing environmental changes facing the world, then and now. But I hope I've said enough to indicate that all of you who are tackling modern environmental problems are heirs, descendants to one of the great environmental success stories on our planet. In closing, and in honor of a former dean of this cathedral, I'd like to quote from a prayer for Expo 74, written by Richard Combs at the time of the World Fair. God of the universe and Father of all men, who has created us in thine image, and hast given us into our keeping a glorious world of air and water and earth, we come to thee deeply conscious in these months that we have played folly with thy trust, but greatly hopeful that we may learn better to fulfill it. We thank thee for the promptings which have led us to these days, for the visions thou hast given us of our new environments, for humanity, for the initiatives and efforts which have brought the nations to Spokane, and for the opportunities we now have before us here. Keep us from wasting them. Hasten the day when men and women shall learn to share as kinfolk the bounties of the world, when the earth may be holy, the good earth, and when thou mayest count men and women as worthy stewards of thy creation.
I'm overwhelmed, and I thank you very much, because I'm sure as a historian you appreciate that the people that don't know their past are sure to err. And we've learned a lot about our past today to keep us on the right trajectory.
If I could say another word, you
Yes? Oh, go ahead. You've got your own.
Oh, that's right. I want that one too. Inquisitiveness. As John is saying, there is that old saying that those who don't know the past are condemned to repeat it. I think you could flip that on its head here, though, and say that those who know this incredible past of Spokane's, and even that last prayer, just as I was reading it, I was thinking, man, this is today, right? This could as easily have been written yesterday. But those who do know the past have some chance of recreating some of the better things in it. So thank you. Thank you.